Greetings, travelers. Welcome to the Holmgang, a phrase that sounds cool, but doesn't really make too much sense upon looking up what Holmgang means. In the world of tanking, there are a grand total of 4 jobs currently at your disposal. Gunbreaker and Paladin have the slightly more involved rotations, Dark Knight has the Blackest Night, and nothing else, and Warrior has Oonga Boonga, truly a job worthy of my ape-like prowess. The simple and smooth nature of Warrior usually provokes the ire of warriors of old to tell you about the glory days when the job was more involved. Yeah, it's been dumbed down a lot comparatively. Warrior has been in the game since A Realm Reborn, and has constantly been in the shadow of the cooler, more popular Paladin, despite viability variants. But like many people, I'm going to completely ignore history, and instead talk about Warrior as it is in Shadowbringers. There are a few reasons why you might not see Warrior as often as the other tanks. One reason is due to the incredibly simple nature of the job. It's a bit easy to get bored, or just feel like a primate whenever you make a mistake, the latter being something that all true warriors know. The other reason why Warrior isn't seen as much is thanks to the fact that unlike every other tank, it has different stat priorities for melding due to the way that inner release functions. Meaning if you plan to have a good gear set and high-end content, your Warrior will be very different from the sets that are relatively comparable for the other tanks. Meaning you have to opt in to mostly playing Warrior and not being as flexible, unless you want 2 entire sets of tanking gear to be optimal. So if you don't plan on optimizing gear, otherwise known as being a casual, then this reason will have no impact on you. But it is something that is important to know up front if you plan to tank in high-end content. On top of all of this, Warrior is one of the weakest tanks in terms of its damage output in raids, but Dark Knight and Warrior are very close in that department. Although Warrior did just get buffed in 5.5, so it might be ahead of Dark Knight as of now. I'm not currently running the numbers on it. Finally, in addition to being boring even at level 80, as you can imagine, leveling this job is even more boring than that. And those are the initial warnings to playing this job. I think we're ready to move into a cave. In order to unlock the job, you must go into the Heart of Darkness by going to Limsa Lominsa, or just start the game as a Marauder. At level 30, you can unlock the Warrior by talking to a big, strong man. When you get the job stone, you should feel the wrinkles on your brain slowly start to become smoother, and that's how you know that you're progressing correctly. While on the topic, me, a player who has cleared at least a savage fight on occasion maybe, have managed to kill many parties while playing Warrior. This includes, but is not limited to, cleaving an entire party in Tsukuyomi, and forgetting to tank the orbs in Susanoo. The normal versions, in case I wasn't clear enough. And that's when I knew I was finally a true warrior, one with no sense of fear. If you're wondering the actual reasons for playing Warrior, it includes being surprisingly good when trying to solo old content unsynced, and being the most environmentally friendly tank, because trash packs will tremble before your might. It also has quite literally just some of the best self-sustain in general, making it a true main tank, and not a wimpy job where every player wants to off-tank. When you combine all of this together, Warrior is absurdly good in dungeons compared to every other tank, and will usually make your healers happy when they see it in any content. With that initiation completed, it's time to talk about some clicks and clacks. Unlike my other tanking videos, I will actually talk about damage first, because it is very straightforward, and I'm mixing it up for myself mostly. I'm even going to start by talking about the rotation, believe it or not. You have 2 3-button combos. The only difference is the 3rd button. One gives you a DPS buff that lasts for 30 seconds, but can be extended to 60 seconds maximum. And the other one will heal you and give you more anger bar. Simple enough, you want to keep the buff going. Generally, you refresh it at 15 seconds or less remaining. Since it is so generous though with how long it can be extended for, even if you manage to fat finger the cooldown at 25 seconds remaining, you don't really get punished for it. I swear, only Jesus Christ himself could display more forgiveness than that. At 50 anger, you can use Fell Cleave and deal damage and receive dopamine. Yes, the good brain chemical. Well, don't get too happy, because you also have this one skill, this single off-global cooldown called Upheaval, that you have to use every 30 seconds. It requires 20 anger. The goal here is easy. You always want to use Upheaval and not accidentally use Fell Cleave too much so that you drift the cooldown of Upheaval due to lack of rage. I understand that warriors are much like Takumi Fujiwara from Initial D and have no sense of fear on the downhill, but you must resist the urge to make an Initial D reference with your cooldowns. You can use Fell Cleave at a minimum of 70 meter for this drift to never be an issue. And if you really want to be a wrinkly-brained warrior, you can try to get more Fell Cleaves in under raid buffs rather than using it immediately at 70 meter by using it somewhere at 70 to 100 meter depending. But if I do that, how else am I supposed to get my dopamine hits? The other off-global cooldown you have to manage is Infuriate. This skill will give you 50 anger, and also turn Fell Cleave into very angry Fell Cleave. It can hold 2 charges, but the cooldown will be reduced every time you cast Fell Cleave, so make sure to not overcap it. But I mean, you can use it anytime you have 1 stack, to be honest. Why optimize more? I just want some more axe-swinging action. Even if you Infuriate and forget to use the big Fell Cleave, it will still buff your next Fell Cleave until you cast it for a whole 30 seconds. Such kindness, so forgiving. The last thing to talk about is your burst window. When you press Inner Release, you will get a buff that allows you to cast Fell Cleave without any anger bar. In addition, all attacks that you use will be critical direct hits for the duration. It will even extend your Storm's Eye buff for 15 seconds. Your goal is to use 5 Fell Cleaves, an Upheaval, and even an Onslaught if you're feeling brave during its duration. Getting 5 Fell Cleaves will typically require you to use Inner Release right before the first Fell Cleave to try to maximize the buff. If you are having trouble, you could use a double weaving window where you use something like Nascent Flash right before Inner Release to make it slightly easier to align. If you are still having problems getting 5 abilities in, even though you're weaving properly, you might want some more skill speed to make it easier. The comfiest and coolest GCD speed is about 2.38 seconds on the recast time, which I am not geared for at all, although the absolute bare minimum recast time is around 2.42 seconds if you're cracked out of your mind. I wouldn't go that slow though. I don't usually mention skill speed tiers, but getting these 5 Fell Cleaves is by far the most important part of your damage output. If you can only get 4, you will have a problem. Another important note is that since every time you use Fell Cleave or very angry Fell Cleave, you reduce Infuriate's cooldown by 5 seconds. So you want to ensure that you don't have like a stack and a half going into Inner Release to avoid overcapping Infuriate. If you start to drift Upheaval due to either fight mechanics, player error, or by naturally pairing it with the GCD, and Inner Release has about 23 seconds or so left on the cooldown, you want to hold Upheaval for your Inner Release phase. You can use an Onslaught as a filler to keep your beast gauge numbers normal, while you hold Upheaval for burst. And that's how Inner Release works. As a side note, while you don't benefit from having extra direct hit during Inner Release, additional critical chance will give you more critical damage. So the only buffs from your party that you don't benefit from are buffs that only affect direct hit, also known as Battle Voice and Army's Payon. The last silly thing about Inner Release, other than making your eyes glow red while using it, is that it will also give you knockback immunity. You will not typically use Inner Release to ignore knockback mechanics, as you will use it on cooldown for damage. However, you should be aware that if a knockback mechanic is happening while you are in an Inner Release phase, you will ignore that knockback mechanic. This happened to me enough times where I wasn't sure why I wasn't getting knocked back, and that's because it's easy to forget that Inner Release even does this. It's just something that you should keep in mind. And another final thing is, unlike every other tank, your dash skill in the form of Onslaught requires 20 meter normally, but is free during Inner Release. You should use it for damage during your burst window because it's literally just extra damage. But outside of this, if you are going to want to use your dash, make sure you have 20 meter to be able to use it. And you can also use it right before the boss dies if you have meter, but not enough to Fell Cleave, and Upheaval is on cooldown. But yes, that's quite literally everything to the core of single target. You know that you're doing your core rotation correctly if you receive happiness upon pressing Fell Cleave and feel anguish when you drift Upheaval, the duality of warrior. I have now built you a solid foundation from which you can rub sticks together and make fire. But you know what else needs a solid foundation? That's right, my YouTube channel. It goes without saying, thanks to viewers like yourself, our channel has grown in size. I plan to do a karaoke livestream at 10,000 subscribers. We only need like, what, 2,600 more? Me being a content creator, the parasitic creatures that we are, I must remind you that if you want to support what I do here, you can always attempt to sway the masses by leaving likes or dislikes, comments, subscribing to my cat girl superiority dogma, and sharing my videos with your coworkers by inserting it into a conversation where it doesn't really make any sense. As always, thank you for your contribution, and may your brain stay nice and shiny. Alright, it's now time to talk about mitigation. Warrior is a job that is a tank. I know that's shocking, but this means that we get the standard 20% mitigation button of Rampart, and your 30% mitigation button is called Vengeance. However, Vengeance is the most special of the 30% mitigation buttons, because while it is active, you also deal damage to everything every time they hit you, making it technically a DPS button as well, but you should use it as mitigation in boss fights. It does do some pretty okay damage in trash packs though, where you're already going to pop a defensive cooldown anyways. The other standard tools include Reprisal, which will afflict all enemies around you with a debuff so that they deal 10% less damage. While this isn't super strong in trash packs, it helps for any attack that a boss uses that damages all players. Just remember that Reprisal debuffs do not stack, so attempt to coordinate with your co-tank in 8-man trials or raids to not waste a cooldown. The last standard tank button is Arm's Length, a button that many new players don't realize is a tank cooldown for trash packs. This is because while it is active, enemies that hit you will attack 20% slower for 15 seconds, which is very solid mitigation. Although this attack speed debuff will not work on bosses, it will allow you to ignore most knockback mechanics while active. I guarantee you, knowing Arm's Length is a tank cooldown will help you a lot while leveling, and you don't have too many tank cooldowns to use yet. As for warrior specific cooldowns, you get Thrill of Battle, which will increase your max health by 20% for 10 seconds, and also heal you for that amount as well. On top of that, at level 78, it will be enhanced so that you also heal for 20% more while it is active. This healing buff will apply to all healing, including your own self-healing skill, but will not apply to your lifesteal effects, which is an important distinction to make. Speaking of self-healing, Equilibrium is an off-global cooldown self-heal on a minute cooldown that heals for as much as an unbuffed Clemency. Very solid, and can be buffed more when paired with enhanced Thrill of Battle. Now this next button shares a cooldown with a very special button, but by itself, Raw Intuition will reduce damage taken by 20% for 6 seconds on a 25-second cooldown. This is available very often, and you can use it pretty much on cooldown until you have to start making decisions with it after level 76. Until then though, just use it in between longer cooldowns while trash tanking, or just use it for fun on bosses. However, before we get into that whole decision-making process, I'm going to mention your party mitigation button in the form of Shake It Off. This will shield your entire party, including yourself, for 15% of their maximum HP respectively. This is different from Paladin's Divine Veil, which will shield all other party members for 10% of the Paladin's maximum HP. While I won't do a massive comparison here, Divine Veil requires a GCD heal to activate, while Shake It Off just fucking works. Divine Veil will shield some party members for more than Shake It Off, but since it doesn't shield the Paladin player themselves, in terms of total party mitigation, the question of which one is better is which number is higher between 15% of the total party's maximum health or 70% of the Paladin's health. It's usually going to break to Shake It Off, although both skills are extremely comparable. But what I haven't mentioned yet is that Shake It Off can shield for even more. When you use it, it will consume up to 3 of your buffs to increase the shield by 2% for each buff eaten. This includes Vengeance, Thrill of Battle, and Raw Intuition. In terms of what you actually want to eat with Shake It Off, Raw Intuition is pretty easy to give up since its cooldown is so short. Thrill of Battle is fine to use if you don't need the extra healing passive for anything that's happening anytime soon, and on top of the extra 2% it gives you, Shake It Off will shield you based on the maximum HP that you had while Thrill of Battle was active before it was eaten for Shake It Off, making your personal shield even bigger. Those two can be pretty okay to pair with Shake It Off, but generally, wasting Vengeance's 30% mitigation for an extra 2% party shield is not worth it. And really, if you want to eat cooldowns with this, it can be a bit of a process to think about it. So you can optimize this more, but it's usually fine to just not eat Vengeance. And it's okay to eat the other cooldowns on occasion if you feel like it. And make sure to actually use Shake It Off every now and again for some raid-wide attacks, because it is a very powerful shield cooldown that's easy to use and is still great even at just the base 15%. Alright, it's time to talk about Nascent Flash. Nascent Flash and Raw Intuition share a cooldown together, so you have to choose which one you want to use based on the situation. Kind of. Raw Intuition will buff Shake It Off, which Nascent Flash does not. What Nascent Flash does do, let me read the tooltip here, heals for damage dealt. Alright, now let me Google how much it actually heals for. Ah yes, 50% of the damage. Why would that information be in the game itself? Maybe using 50% was too intimidating for casual. Oh, the Nascent Glint effect has 50% used in its description. I hate tooltips. For anyone out there who screams at people to read their tooltips like myself, I think we should start screaming, Google your abilities instead. You can also target another player who will take 10% reduced damage and will be healed for 50% of what you heal through Nascent Flash. This cooldown, when used, will apply to damage dealt for the next 3 GCDs typically. In single target, you will heal for a silly amount on just yourself, even before considering what you heal on another target. At current gear tier, if you use either 3-button combo and an Upheaval while it is active, you can heal for more than 50,000 damage, which is a fuck ton. And you can really only start to heal for more if you use a Fell Cleave during its duration, and it gets real dumb during Inner Release or when using Inner Chaos. This shit heals for way more than Raw Intuition can mitigate for almost every use case. Now, is Raw Intuition useless? No, as I mentioned, it can still buff Shake It Off, although the total party mitigation gain is still usually less than what you can heal through Nascent Flash. But also, if you need a tank cooldown to not die to a tank buster and everything else is on cooldown, then yeah, Raw Intuition is much better to use to not die, because you can't heal if you're not alive in the first place. Also, if your healers are exceptionally quick and you're already at full HP, you can't get any value out of Nascent Flash if there's no damage to heal off in the first place. In which case, once again, Raw Intuition can be more useful. However, Raw Intuition becomes more niche the more optimized your gameplay gets, and Nascent Flash is almost always going to be the better choice. This single cooldown is so good, and is pretty much the Blackest Night on Dark Knight, but stronger. The last thing I will mention for Nascent Flash is if you want to use a macro so that you can always target your co-tank, here is the macro that I use. I also changed my settings so that while playing tank, my other tank is always in the second slot of my party, which you can do by going to Character Configuration, UI Settings, Party List Sorting, and change the sort order to tank first. There are other macros to use with Nascent Flash that will have a failsafe if the other target is not in range, but I like to have both the regular old skill and the macro on my hotbar as of now, so that I can Nascent Flash selfishly if I want to, while also occasionally being able to heal a different party member. The macro is not absolutely necessary, but it can make your life a little bit easier. And that's most of everything about why you should love Nascent Flash. Alright, finally I'll mention your invulnerability skill. You get Holmgang at level 42. This skill will tether the enemy that you are currently targeting and also make it so that you cannot be reduced below 1 HP for 8 seconds upon use. If you are not targeting an enemy, it will just give you the invuln effect and not the tether. The only weird thing about this skill is that if you are targeting an enemy and it's out of range, you will not be able to use Holmgang. So if you need to not die and the boss is very far away, make sure to deselect the target, or just use a macro that will always target yourself and it will work all the time. But you could also just be good at the game. This is the weakest invulnerability effect in the game, but it only has a cooldown of 4 minutes, making it possible for Warrior to consistently cheese certain mechanics more often than any other tank, although this is fight dependent. If you can't abuse how short the cooldown is in high-end content, then it gets much worse than every other invulnerability effect. And that's really everything about Holmgang. Sweet, with mitigation and single target rotation out of the way, let me teach you how to crawl in dungeons. Warrior is the best trash man in Final Fantasy XIV, thanks to a few important tools. One of these being Spinny Fellcleave and Very Angry Spinny Fellcleave. Warrior does most of its damage in burst windows, therefore they can help clear packs quickly. Inner Release will work with Decimate and Fellcleave, so you should use Decimate in trash packs. You also have ludicrous self-sustain thanks to Nascent Flash, which is actually stupid in mob packs. The raw healing output you can do with just Nascent Flash will make it so that your healer doesn't have to do anything most of the time other than cast damage. I've had plenty of instances with high-end warriors where an AFK healer didn't mean anything when going through trash packs. It's actually broken. Anyways, for maximum damage output, you usually want to use your single target combo first to get your DPS buff before shredding everything to death. You typically want to make sure that you secure aggro on the pack before casually using a single target combo. So make sure that you use your 2-button AoE combo to acquire the mob damage output before getting that buff. Once you have the buff, the second button of your AoE combo will refresh it from then onwards. As an alternative measure, you can also get your DPS buff on the very first trash pack before pulling wall to wall. But your team will usually leave you behind if you spend more than like 1.5 seconds extra on the first pack. But this is a method that can work. Now that you have that trash piled up, make sure to pop a tank cooldown, usually Vengeance for some extra damage. You can pop Nascent Flash when you start to lose some health and Infuriate to get a chaotic cyclone, and then Inner Release and just spin away. Or you can use Nascent Flash to help you weave Inner Release, but it doesn't really matter. You'll be fucking invincible as you blender the mobs, leaving cure spamming white mages lost and confused as your HP doesn't drop below 2% for them to do anything. And by the time you finish Inner Release, everything's probably dead anyways. Then it's time to move on to the next pack. Your 2-button AoE combo will also start to give you anger in the higher levels, and when you have enough, you want to use it on Decimate. Warrior does unfortunately have the problem of having a cone-shaped AoE for its first button and a circle AoE for everything else. So try to hit everything as best you can. Although it can be a bit awkward at times, it's something that you'll just have to practice because no other tank class has to deal with this. Your 2-button AoE combo will be a DPS increase on 2 targets, but if you're fighting exactly 2 enemies, then Fellcleave is better than Decimate. Also, it's best practice to use your tank cooldowns one at a time in trash packs to ensure that you always have one available. And basically just use Nascent Flash on cooldown in trash packs because it's fucking beautiful. Warrior will start to make you almost wish that there were even bigger pulls to do in level 80 dungeons. Although I still would say, try not to make your healer feel uncomfortable. And that's everything to know about dungeon crawling. It's now the part of the video where I get to screw up my opener. In any 8-man content, before anything, you're going to have to decide who will main tank. Obviously, it's going to be you. You're the big, strong warrior. You're going to have to main tank. Or, I guess anyone can tank. It's not like it really matters. Although Warrior is so good as a main tank to actually take advantage and abuse how good Nascent Flash is. So you really have to show them who's boss. Unlike me. Anyways, if you are main tanking, make sure that you have tank stance on. Before I go over the opener, I am starting this with Tomahawk, because unlike those wrinkly-brained warriors, my smooth brain can't face-pull bosses. Although if you are face-pulling, your Infuriate timings will be slightly different, but still use your first one as soon as possible. We begin by pulling with Tomahawk. You want to use Infuriate as soon as you can. It might take a second for the game to register that you are in combat. If the game is being uncooperative, you can Infuriate on the next GCD as you become infuriated in real life. We then use our 3-button combo with Heavy Slash, Maim, this is when you can use a damage pot, and finish with Storm's Eye for that sweet DPS buff. We now use Inner Chaos, or Very Angry Fellcleave as I called it before. We are now going to use Inner Release next. So you can use Nascent Flash in a double weaving window to help align the buff better, or you can just get good and properly weave Inner Release right before Fellcleave. Now Fellcleave, then weave Upheaval. Fellcleave and weave Onslaught. Fellcleave. 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 And now we weave Infuriate and use Inner Chaos. Use Heavy Swing and weave Infuriate again to now use Inner Chaos. We now use Maim and then use Storm's Path. Use Fellcleave. Now use a final 3-button combo, finishing with your DPS buff, and you can weave another Upheaval to finish this insanely long opener. For attentive viewers, you might notice that you use Fell Cleave and Inner Chaos, which are the same button, a grand total of 9 times during this opener, making this class truly the one-button wonder. Congratulations, you are now in your normal gameplay that I described earlier. The only thing I skipped over is talking about Inner Chaos. So every time you use Infuriate, you get 50 anger and you get to use Inner Chaos. This skill will also always be a critical direct hit every time you use it. Generally, past the opener, you want to try and use this skill as often enough to not overcap the cooldown of Infuriate, while also trying to get Inner Chaos in during raid buffs. Since it is always a critical direct hit, once again, it will not benefit from direct hit buffs. The priority with this skill is to use it if you would overcap Infuriate, but otherwise, try to get some benefit out of it. This is the one skill that can be, dare I say, a little bit more freeform. But if you want your brain to remain smooth and shiny, just use Infuriate when you get a stack and don't accidentally overfill your rage gauge. To conclude everything, the damage skills to keep track of are Inner Release, which you get every 90 seconds. Make sure to get those 5 Fell Cleaves, an Upheaval, and an Onslaught in during its duration. Every 30 seconds you will get Upheaval, which you need 20 rage to use, so ensure that you have enough to use it on cooldown. Infuriate will also gain a stack every 60 seconds, but will be reduced by 5 seconds every time you cast a Fell Cleave variant. So make sure to stay on top of it, like I said in the previous paragraph that I typed for this script. Also, the simple way to use Storm's Eye is to use it whenever you have 15 seconds or left remaining on the buff. Finally, if you're going to want to use Onslaught for mobility, it requires 20 anger. And that's pretty much the priority list for being a warrior. The other amazing utility that you have includes Provoke, to take aggro away from a tank, only necessary for tank swapping and high-end content, and getting boss aggro if your other tank dies, or if you just really want to steal aggro from them. Shirk will divert aggro to another party member, which is useful for putting aggro on the other tank. Interject can interrupt abilities with a red outline, which is occasionally important to do, and finally, Low Blow can stun a single enemy to not move out of AoEs and trash packs. To conclude, Warrior is a job. It's actually a pretty fun job. Almost everyone likes the mitigation tools. You won't hear people complain about that aspect. Its damage is very straightforward to a fault. Although it can be a bit boring at times in terms of the variety, it has enough room to optimize as well as gives you time to focus more on utilizing tank cooldowns. It's arguably the best main tank, and even in high-end content, it's useful for learning that hard content thanks to being forgiving to play and having so much sustain that your healers won't have to feel too much pressure. If you're trying to pick up tanking and you don't know where to start, Warrior is a fantastic choice, thanks to not being overly complex and giving you room to be more comfortable with tank cooldowns. They could give it a little bit more variety for some damage cooldowns, but I like having at least one tank that's a bit more simple. I surprisingly enjoy my time playing this job, but I don't have a gear set for it, so it just kind of sits on the side while I play Gunbreaker. Now let's get out there and cast some fucking Fell Cleaves. Hello again, travelers. It's me, Editing Chair. I'm just here to give a couple of shoutouts. Thanks to the members of my Discord who answered my questions when I was doing research for this video. Also shoutouts in particular to Sam from My Static, who played Warrior and helped me a lot, and Ellie, who has also helped me a lot when I was trying to figure out what the hell to do with this job.